Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today, as promised, to go over some of my almost best books of 2021. I did my top 10 video with my husband Joel because we were both doing it. We wanted to really focus on just the top 10, so I didn't have time to do it like a top 20 like I would usually do, although I have in the past done almost best books of the year as well. So I will link my actual top 10 in the description box down below. Please feel free to check that out if you have not already. Lots of people were really excited that I did it with Joel this year. I thought it was a lot of fun to film, so I'm glad you enjoyed having him there and hearing what he had to say about his favorite reads of 2021. So we'll try to find ways to get him back on the channel periodically so everyone can say hello. Now, I was delaying doing this because I kept trying to force an order onto the books that almost were my favorites of 2021, and I was really struggling with how to do that. So what I decided to do is have no order, but I will separate out the books that were probably the closest to cracking into my top 10, and I'll talk about them first. One of them was Taste by Stanley Tucci. This was I think this might have been in Joel's top 10, if not, it was close to it. And this is something that we both actually read and enjoyed. It's almost like a companion to Searching for Italy, which is his CNN show, but the show is much more about Italy and the food politics of Italy and the history of food and socio-political stuff in Italy. The book is much more about his personal life and his journey with food. And I love the idea of a memoir told through food. He is a very charming person, and the book is very charming as well. I did not listen to this on audio, but even though I didn't, I could hear his voice carrying me through on every page. I think he's also very funny. I just really enjoyed this book a great deal. If you're looking for more of like a Hollywood or celebrity memoir, there's not that much here. It is much more about like his personal life and his family and his relationship to food over time and how food is sort of an expression of love in his family. So there is a little bit of Hollywood dish, like he has a dinner with Meryl Streep that is very funny, but it's not like a dishy memoir, or it's not where you go for like Hollywood gossip or anything like that. I think it's well worth your time anyway, but if that's your thing, this is not the book for you necessarily. The other three books that were closest to being in my top 10 are not books I actually have copies of. The first one is The Soul of an Octopus by Montgomery. I really enjoyed this book. It was recommended by Doris at All D Books, and it just taught me a lot. It's a really charming book written with a sort of palpable love and enthusiasm by Montgomery. You really get a sense of how much she loves and cares for the octopuses that she meets while she is working with an aquarium to sort of get to know how they care for octopuses. And because her enthusiasm is so palpable and her love for the octopuses and the people that she meets is so resonant, it is emotionally devastating when octopuses die in the book because they have a very short lifespan. So at least 3 of the octopuses that she works with do pass on during the course of the book. And you really get attached to them. And it's just an interesting book. It taught me a lot. It felt like a great emotional ride. So this was a fantastic recommendation by Doris. I really, really enjoyed it. I read it for Montana Book Company's 2021 Reading Challenge, which required that you read a science or nature nonfiction book. And that is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but I enjoyed this so much that I would be willing to try another one. So I may go back to the other recommendations that Doris had sent me and see if I want to do one of them in 2022. The Montana Book Company hasn't released their reading challenge for 2022 yet, and if there's a category for it, I would love to do another one. The next one is Hidden Valley Road, Inside the Mind of an American Family by Robert Kolker. This is a bit of a difficult book because of the subject matter. It can be really harrowing in parts. If you have read Educated by Tara Westover, it's kind of in the same vein as that, where it's a fascinating book. It has really beautiful, emotionally resonant stuff in it, but it can be difficult to read because of the things that happen to the people in the book. Now, this is about a family. They had a bunch of children. I can't remember the exact number, and many of the sons turned out to be schizophrenic. And it's about the changing understanding of mental health and schizophrenia in particular in this country because when the first son was diagnosed, there was very little understanding of what schizophrenia was and what caused it. For instance, the mother was looked at very harshly by the doctors because it was assumed that she had done something wrong to make her sons schizophrenic. Schizophrenia was not understood to be something that people were born with and that developed over time. And it's about the stigmas of mental health as well, and how over time those have not really changed. But in the beginning, the family hides the first son's diagnosis, and when the second son starts to exhibit behavior that would be common with schizophrenia, they try to cover up, and they don't necessarily realize, oh, this has already happened before, because they want to hide the sort of shame of having a schizophrenic son. But because they are doing that, negative things happen. There is like a murder-suicide over time. Two of their daughters are subject to abuse because of the covering up. And there are a lot of things that happen within this family that need to be reconciled over time. But it is a really interesting, fascinating book, very well told by Robert Kolker, if you can stomach all of those potential trigger warnings. And the final book that I'm going to say almost cracked into my top 10 is Zorrie by Laird, which is a tiny book. It's only small, and yet packs a really emotional punch. I was pretty staggered by the emotional heft of the book, especially since it seems very subtle when you read it, but it really talks a lot about grief and the passage of time and how life can sort of get away from you, but it's also about how beautiful everyday ordinary lives, I'm going to stop doing air quotes, I promise, are. And, since I think most of us probably live everyday ordinary lives, it hits you right in all the feels. So I really deeply appreciated that book as well. It was a finalist for the National Book Award, did not win. But I would say those 4 books are probably the ones that came the closest to cracking into my top 10. Let's start talking about some of the other books that are my almost favorites. Some of these did come close to cracking in the top 10 as well. I'm not going to focus on I'd still say that those 4 came the closest, but again, I'm going to talk about these in no particular order. The first one is, actually, let's go with one that I don't have. It's This Town Sleeps by Dennis E. Staples. This is something I listened to on audio earlier in 2021, and if you are a fan of Louise Erdrich, I'd say definitely check this book out. His style and the way he tells the story kind of fit in with her. And part of me does hate making that comparison, because I think the danger is that people will then pick up This Town Sleeps and expect it to be Louise Erdrich. And it's not, it's close. It's in the same ballpark, but it's different. So I'd say if you like Louise Erdrich, check it out, but don't expect it to be exactly the same. It almost flirts with sort of mystery thriller conventions, but I'd say the sort of mystery-ish aspect of the book is not as important as the dramatic relationships and storytelling, and the idea that this is a queer story set within a Native community. I just found it really interesting, and I would absolutely recommend it and say it is well worth your time. The next one is A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. I read the Berlin Stories a while ago and have always wanted to read something else of his, so I finally got around to A Single Man. I actually listened to it on audio, but I do have this tiny pocket edition of it from Picador Modern Classics, which is a really beautiful cover. And I knew I liked the Berlin Stories, so it's not all that surprising, but I really liked this book a lot. I listened to it on audio, as I said. The narrator was fantastic. It has this tone of anger and disappointment and grief, but there's also a tinge of hope to it, that things will get better or that things could be better. And I really appreciated that. It is another gay story. I read it in June for my Pride Month reading, which is what I do in the month of June every year. And if you have not read this, I'd say, if nothing else, put it on your pile of possibilities for Pride Month, because it's a great book. The audio was fantastic as well. And it's really small. The audio was very short. I think it was maybe 4 hours at most. So definitely check that one out. The next one is Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel. This is something that I saw for $1 at a used bookstore in Helena, I believe, and then I picked it up and read it, and I really enjoyed it. It's a novel, the way it's described on the cover is a novel in monthly installments with recipes, romances, and home remedies, which kind of gets you right into the mindset that this is a bit of a quirky book. It's really beautifully put together as well. So each month is like a recipe in a cookbook. So chapter 1, January, Christmas rolls, which got me really excited, but then the recipe is not something I would be very interested in. So you have your recipe, and then it tells you what the ingredients are. In this case, 1 can sardines, half a chorizo sausage, 1 onion, oregano, 1 can of chili serranos, and 10 hard rolls. It's the sardines that kind of kill it for me. And then the chapter is the preparation. So within the story, it kind of goes through and tells you how the dish is prepared. Not literally, but somebody is preparing it in it. And then when you get to the next chapter, here we go. To be continued. Next month's recipe, Chabella wedding cake, which is, of course, what February is. And then you have your list of ingredients again. And then the preparation is the chapter. It's a really interesting way of telling a book. This does have elements of magical realism. If that's not something you are a fan of, maybe stay away from this book. But I really thought it was pulled off very well. It has dramatic undertones. It can be funny. It can be very surprising. It can be a little sexual in parts. And I went on a wild ride with this book, and I really appreciated all of the places that it took me. So I would recommend Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel, which is something that I had been wanting to read for a long time anyway. The next one was an audio that I listened to possibly in June. I don't remember. It was You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson. This is a YA lesbian romance. It is about a girl who wants to go to college and is afraid that she is not going to be able to pay for it. And she happens to go to a high school where prom is really emphasized to the point where if you are crowned prom queen, you get a college scholarship. So she joins the court and starts campaigning for prom queen, hoping that she will win and that the prize money will let her go to college. So right away you have this element of, finance and economics, because she is an underprivileged, and she's not even poor, but compared to her classmates, she is underprivileged. She is a black student in a predominantly white school. And of course, she falls in love with another girl who is running for prom queen. And it's about all of the complications from there. It is a surprisingly fun but emotionally hefty story, and I really enjoyed it a great deal. And I love that there are so many LGBTQ romances in the YA market, and I love that a lot of them have deeper meaning packed in. Like, this book says a lot about race and money and the state of this country and what we put value on and all of that stuff. So I would definitely recommend checking it out as well. The next one is Whereabouts by Jhumpa Lahiri, which is a bit of a departure from her previous work. And I wouldn't have necessarily guessed that I would be looking for a departure from her previous work, but it really paid off. It was a little surprising. The chapters are tiny little bursts. And again, kind of in the same ballpark as Zorrie, it seems very quiet, and yet it reveals so much about this character and the way she goes through life and the point of her life that she is at and the decision. She's sort of at a fork in her road, and she's wondering what the rest of her life is going to be. And I think it builds to a very emotional climax in a very subtle way. And I really appreciated it a lot. So I would recommend checking that out as well, especially if you're a fan of hers. It's different from her other books, but I really appreciated what it does. She originally wrote it in Italian and then translated it into English herself, which is a kind of interesting approach to a book. The next one is Real Life by Brandon Taylor. This was something I read for the BookTube Prize, and it was something I had really wanted to read in 2020 and didn't get to, so I was glad I managed to fit it in 2021. I really appreciate a lot of this book. I think the way it talks about depression is interesting, and the sort of self-destructive things that you can do when you are depressed. It's just really well captured. And I know that aspect of the book has turned a lot of people off. I think if you haven't necessarily struggled with depression, you might not recognize what's happening. But also the idea of racism and the way microaggressions build and can cause this kind of depression and this sense of isolation and this sense that you don't belong, which can spin into a sort of self-sabotage situation. Having not experienced microaggressions in terms of race, it's a concept I know and I understand, but it's nothing I have experienced. And this book really puts you in that situation, because we think of racism as something that's overt. If someone is racist, they are doing wildly racist things that everybody would call racist. And a lot of the things that happen in this book are not overtly racist. There are things that are overtly racist, but a lot of it is just small things that really build and make the character feel like he is out of place. And I thought that was a very profound experience in a book. And it made me really want to read more by Brandon Taylor. He's also a great follow on Twitter. I got his collection of short stories from the library, but I was in the middle of other things, so I had to return it and get back on the wait list. I'm looking forward to that one as well. The next book is a nonfiction. I have more nonfiction in my almost best than I did in my top 10. There was no nonfiction in my top 10. And here we have Last Call, a true story of love, lust, and murder in queer New York. I don't do a lot of true crime, and if you follow along, you know that. Basically, I feel like a lot of true crime feels lurid and ends up glorifying the killer at the expense of the victims. So for me to engage in true crime, it has to be doing something else. Like there was a graphic novel by the son of the police officer who investigated the Green River Killer. And more than being about the Green River Killer, it's about the emotional toll of the investigation on his father. The Five by Hallie Rubenhold is a book that removes Jack the Ripper from the equation as much as possible to focus on the lives of the 5 women that he murdered and to give them their stories back. And that's a bit of what Last Call is. It focuses much more on the victims, who are all gay men in the late 80s and early 90s, who were picked up at a bar in New York that still exists, by the way, and the ways in which they lived, the ways the end of their lives had sort of ripple effects, and the way in which police didn't necessarily catch on. And part of that is because the killer crossed state lines, which made it more difficult to catch on to what was happening. But because the gay community was so marginalized, especially in that point, because there was so much panic about the AIDS epidemic, that their lives didn't matter as much as other people. And I thought that was a really profound and interesting story. It does focus in a little bit more on the killer in the end, but I thought it was the stories of the victims that really elevated this book a lot, and I found it very interesting. Next, we have another nonfiction book, Forced Out, a detective story of prejudice and resilience by Kevin Maxwell. This is the story of, obviously, Kevin Maxwell. He wanted to be a police officer for a long time, but he is Black and gay, and it's about the struggles that he had joining the police force and staying on the police force in the UK, and a lot of the things that he experiences are infuriating. Like, they made me really angry. It almost seems like it would be ridiculous that he would experience the type of things that he does experience, and yet it's entirely too believable that this is the kind of thing that would happen. So it was a very eye-opening book. It's a book that gives you a clarifying rage because it didn't happen that long ago. And ultimately, he was, in fact, forced out of the police force. That is not a spoiler. It's the premise of the book. It's about how he was eventually forced out and how this person who had wanted nothing more than to serve his community by being a police officer was deemed to be less than other officers because of his race and because of his sexuality, and the ways in which in the beginning of his career he had to hide those things. He couldn't hide his race, but he had to hide his sexuality because it was like this double stigma. And like I said, there's a sort of clarifying rage that you get from reading this book that is almost purifying, and I definitely recommend it if you can deal with that. Sorry for the awkward cut. I had to move a little bit down on the couch because my buddy Guinness is here now. You can see the top of his head hanging out on this side. He couldn't jump on this side of the couch because Jamie is there. So anyway, I had to move over on the couch. So let's continue. The next book is Camp by L.C. Rosen. This is something that I had seen on Jen the Librarian's channel and picked up, ordered a copy for myself, and I really enjoyed reading this in the month of June. This was definitely one of my Pride Month reads this year, and it is an LGBTQ romance in the style of those kind of old rom-coms. One of the characters pretends to be someone other than he is, and in order to attract the person that he is crushing on, and things kind of spiral out from there. In this case, the main character is a very effeminate teenager. He goes to a camp for LGBTQ kids that is supposed to be a safe space, and he loves theater. He is part of the theater camp, but he's in love with a jock who has been going every summer. This year, he figures he can catch the jock's attention if he changes his appearance, hides all of the effeminate traits that he has about himself, does not participate in theater, and starts doing a bunch of more athletic activities in the camp. So it's about, in a subtle way, under the surface, it's about how this safe space that was created for LGBTQ kids has created these hierarchies of what is acceptable, because the jocks look down on the theater kids, and the love interest is a very masculine person and is very afraid of being effeminate. That's kind of where what it turns into, but he looks down on effeminate people. So there's this push and pull for the protagonist, because he actually is one of those things, and he has to question over the course of the book whether or not he will be accepted. And again, it's supposed to be in a safe space for LGBTQ kids. There is a camp counselor who acts as a sort of mentor for the protagonist. I love that character. Billy Porter is actually going to be making a movie of this, and I think he's going to be starring in it. I assume the camp counselor is the person that he's going to play, and I'm really looking forward to that. I think it's going to be a fun movie, and it was a fun book. I really enjoyed it. So I would say check that out if you have not already. I usually go to mystery thrillers if I'm in the mood for, if I need like a comfort read or anything like that. And lately I've been doing LGBTQ YA romance, or just LGBTQ romance, because it's so nice that these books exist and they just get me in all of the feels. I'm a sentimental sap in a lot of ways, I guess. The next one was Nomadland by Jessica Bruder. I really enjoyed the movie of Nomadland, so I read the book. The book is very different. The book is very political. I did a whole comparison of the book and the movie, which I'll put in the description box down below if you'd like to check it out. I know there are people who are not a fan of the book. I know there are people who are not a fan of the movie. I really liked both. I feel like both should be treated as separate entities, so do with that information what you will. And again, maybe check out the book versus movie comparison that I did if you would like more about that. But the book is much more political. It is much more about companies that take advantage of nomads, Amazon in particular, because they are one of the most egregious examples of companies that do that. And they've created whole systems that are built around exploiting the nomad workforce, and in ways that keep them on the fringes of society and in the lifestyle that they are in. So I definitely would recommend it. If you're a fan of the movie, don't go in expecting the movie, because it's not going to be that. And if you are a fan of the book and you want to see the movie, don't go in expecting the book. They're very different things. The next one is a book that is now called Melissa by Alex Gino, but at the time I read it, it was still called George. Honestly, I don't know why it was ever called George in the first place. The name Melissa makes so much more sense. So it is a middle grade book about a child who knows that they are transgender, and the struggle to come out and be accepted, because outwardly Melissa is known as George and everybody knows her as a boy. And yet Melissa has created her real identity, Melissa, and can't share it with anyone. And the sort of crux of all of this is that the school is putting on a play production of Charlotte's Web, and Melissa wants to audition for Charlotte, and people won't, because they're all saying, but you're a boy, you can't play Charlotte. And yet Melissa also has a friend who's very accepting, and it's like, well, sure, okay, let's help you audition for Charlotte. And it's a very cute story. It's very short. I listened to the audio, and it's really a quick listen, and it's a very cute story. Again, I love that this book exists for middle grade readers. It is one of the most banned books in the country because it is about a transgender kid and because it has this message of acceptance. So if you can throw some support this book's way. Again, it's funny though, because it is such an accepting, supporting, upbeat book, I don't really understand why the dead name of the character was used as the title originally, but I'm really glad they fixed it and used the true name. So definitely check that out if you are so inclined. The next book, if I can reach it, my pile is now very far away from me, is Damnation Spring by Ash Davidson. I went on a whole journey with this book this year because if you follow along, you know, around October, I hit a reading slump and it was kind of anxiety based. And this book was triggering that. And it was based on concern for Guinness, who is now asleep right here because he was having some health problems this year. And I won't get into that right now. But one of the things that I oddly fixated on in this book was that it's about a family. They have a dog. And I knew that something was going to happen to the dog. And I started fixating on it and stressing myself. And it built anxiety. And then something does happen to the dog. So if that's a trigger for you, because I know a lot of people have commented to tell me that it is, go into this book you tread lightly with this book. And I had to take a break. And I finally, at the end of the year, got back and finished it. And I'm really glad I did because it is a very good book. It does have a lot of trigger warnings. There's also abuse. There are miscarriages and women who have babies born with birth defects. In some cases, very serious birth defects because they have been exposed to pollutants and pesticides that are supposed to be fine for humans, but obviously are not. It's set in 1977, so it gives you an idea of all of that stuff. So it's a really good book. It's a very empathetic book. Ash Davidson moves around all of the characters and kind of understands them, which I think is a very good thing. And I would recommend it if you can get around all of those other triggers, as I said. It's a great book. I did it on audio. I think it would do well in either format. So definitely check that out if you are so inclined. The next one is the final revival of Opal and Nev. This was one of my most anticipated reads of 2021, and boy, did it pay off. It is told in an oral history format, but what's interesting about this is that there's a sort of twist about halfway through that it still stays in the oral history format, but the intention behind it kind of changes. The person putting the oral history together has an emotional stake in the story that people are telling in the oral history, which, and this sounds confusing, but it's done really cleverly in the book. And it's explained in the beginning. I believe the introduction to the book is the person who's editing the oral history explaining their stake in this situation. So her father was the drummer for Opal and Nev, who are a music act that did one hit album, and then I think they put one or two other albums together before kind of fading out. And then Nev went on to have a successful solo career, and Opal kind of faded away. So her father was the drummer for Opal and Nev. They had a performance that started a riot, and in the riot, the drummer was killed. And Opal had been having an affair with the drummer. Well, the drummer was married and had just had the baby, who grows up to be the editor of the book, and he had been sleeping with Opal on the side. So there are all kinds of entanglements in this book. But what it's really about is race and who gets to tell a story, who gets blamed for things that happen, what we allow certain people to get away with, and what stories we allow to tell. It's really interesting. It spins in a lot of different directions. I don't think it sticks all of the landings, but it's a very interesting book, and I loved the way it used the oral history format. I thought that was very interesting, so I would recommend this one as well. And that's it. Those are all of my almost best books of 2021. There are other books that I liked, but these are definitely the ones that stood out, although maybe not enough to make it into my top 10. I would love to hear what you think about any of these books. If you haven't shared your favorite reads of 2021, I would love to hear them in the comment section, not the description box down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.